The slums near the Spire were a graveyard of shattered dreams, where desperation clung to the air like a disease. The Hound stalked through the ruins, his boots making no sound against the cracked pavement, his cybernetic eye flickering as it fed him data. Heat signatures, movement patterns, radiation levels. The streets were empty at this hour, but the silence was deceptive. Nothing in the slums stayed quiet for long. He had spent the last 3 hours crawling through the filth of the Undercity, hunting for a ghost. But Dr. Elias Kurran wasn't a ghost. He was a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. The Hound moved with calculated precision, his hyperkinetic rail pistol heavy in his grip. The weapon's charge indicator pulsed a faint blue, waiting. It wasn't a gun meant for mercy. It was a weapon designed to tear a man apart. That suited him just fine. The slums birthed horror stories every night. Bodies found in alleyways, throats slashed for half a meal ration, gangs collecting their dues in blood, the sick rotting in abandoned buildings waiting to die. The Hound had learned long ago that the city didn't care. But this was different. The first death occurred last month, a simple surgery gone wrong. Hardly unique in the slum, but there have been dozens since. Desperate people lured by the promise of cheap black market medical tech, only to die screaming when their bodies rejected the second-hand cybernetics, the failing life support modules, the corrupt biographs. Someone had been selling death, and the Hound had followed its scent. A few beaten informants and a shattered kneecap or two had given him a name. Dr. Elias Kurran, an old name he knew well. A former corporate scientist exiled from Aegis Biosolutions for reasons buried under classified reports and NDA vaults. A man with knowledge, connections, and the kind of arrogance that let him play God with broken lives. And tonight he would face judgment. The clinic stood in the skeleton of a pre-collapse medtech facility, its sign long since scavenged for scrap. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it gang-tagged, some of it symbols that made the Hound's skin prickle. Whistler markings, they were watching. The cybernetic eye zoomed in, scanning the decayed structure. There! A single, weak heat signature inside. Kurran. The Hound exhaled slowly. He was here. Good. He slipped into the building through a shattered loading dock, moving through the darkness like a phantom. The air reeked of old blood and disinfectant, the sickly sweet scent of death, half masked by chemicals. Inside, a single light flickered. A desk covered in medical equipment stood in the center of the room. Half-dissected cybernetics, biographs floating in amber fluid, racks of vials filled with something dark. And beside them, Kurran. The man was gaunt, dressed in a filthy lab coat, sleeves rolled up to his needle-riddled forearms. He was testing something, a device clamped onto a man's arm. The patient, barely conscious, moaned through clenched teeth as the machinery burrowed into his skin. The Hound leveled his pistol. Kurran. The doctor didn't even flinch. Kurran turned slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Well, he sighed, I was wondering when someone like you would show up. Nice mask, by the way. The Hound's pistol didn't waver. How many? His voice was low, a growl of restrained fury. Kurran raised an eyebrow. How many what? The Hound stepped closer. How many died screaming? How many were thrown into the fire for your experiments? Kurran's mouth twitched. He laughed, a thin, rasping sound. I'm saving lives, you fool. They're sick, weak, dying. I give them a chance to be something more. You sold them poison? You can't stop what's coming. You don't even understand it, Kurran hissed back. The Hound's trigger finger twitched, and then the lights died. For a split second, the world was pitch black. The Hound's cybernetic eye recalibrated instantly, switching to thermal mode. He expected a fight. Instead, Kurran was gone. His cybernetic eye flickered. Movement detected. Not human. A chill crawled up the hound's spine. Something shifted in the dark. The silence broke, a whisper of chitin against concrete. From the far end of the clinic came a sound that did not belong in this world. The whistling. But it disappeared before he could fire. The slums were built on old bones. Long before the war, before the fall of the Spire, this district had been a different kind of ruin. Corrupt officials, corporate slumlords, and black market syndicates had hollowed it out from the inside, leaving a festering corpse of civilization in its place. And the Medina gang was just another parasite feasting on the rot. The Hound moved through the darkened alleyways, his long coat shifting against the cold night air, his cybernetic eye flickering as it scanned the area. A police station had once stood at the heart of this district, a beacon of law, order, control. Now it was a fortress of criminals. Towering security walls of scrap metal ringed the perimeter, festooned with razor wire and old corporate auto turrets, half-fanged shy and rusted from years of neglect. The entrance was manned by at least 6 guards, all of them sporting military-grade firearms, salvaged from long-dead security forces. Through his cybernetic HUD, the Hound caught the faint signatures of dozens more inside. Kurran had paid these men for protection, but the Hound didn't care. Slipping between the shadows, the Hound circled to the station's rear entrance. A reinforced blast door, meant to withstand riots, now coated in gang insignia and crude kill count markers. He touched the lock panel, his cybernetic fingers pulsing with stored electrical charge. With a twist of his wrist, the system fried instantly. The door groaned open an inch, then 2, just enough. Inside, the air was thick with the stink of blood, oil, and burnt narcotics. The Medina gang had repurposed the old interrogation rooms into torture chambers, the old holding cells into barracks, the armory into a stockpile of stolen weapons. The Hound moved like a ghost through the halls, his footfalls barely making a sound, his hand tightening around his weapon. The hyperkinetic rail pistol hummed softly as it charged, its magnetic coils glowing a faint, deadly blue. A Medina thug stood at the entrance to the main barracks, leaning against a rusted doorway, a pistol in one hand, a cigarette in the other. He never saw the Hound coming. One swift strike to the back of the neck and he went down. Inside, the barracks were crowded, filthy, dimly lit. Half a dozen men were inside, laughing, drinking, counting stolen goods. The Hound stepped forward, his voice low, measured. Elias Kurran. The room froze. For a moment only the static buzz of an old radio filled the silence. Then one of them moved, too slow. One thug lunged with a knife. The Hound sidestepped, planting a boot against his knee with bone-snapping force. Another leveled a shotgun. The Hound fired his rail pistol point blank, the kinetic blast hurling the shooter back against the wall. The Hound wasn't there to fight fair. He was there to kill. The last man standing was different. Bigger, heavily armored, cybernetically enhanced. The Hound knew his kind. Ex-military, wired for war, built for slaughter. Garrick. The enforcer cracked his knuckles, rolling his broad shoulders. His augmented arms whined with mechanical tension, artificial muscle bundles tightening beneath his skin. "You've got nerve, coming here alone," Garrick said, voice like grinding steel. The Hound didn't respond. Garrick lunged, a cybernetic fist swinging like a wrecking ball. The Hound ducked. The punch obliterated an old filing cabinet, metal shearing apart like paper. Fast. Strong. But not smart. The Hound moved inside his guard, planted his knee into the man's ribs, then drove his elbow into the base of his skull. Garrick staggered, then grinned. "You're gonna wish you stayed dead, Hound." The enforcer activated his arm-mount blade, a military-grade monofilament edge, sharp enough to carve through reinforced armor. The Hound dropped low, barely avoiding a decapitating arc. Then he fired. A single, hyperkinetic round, point blank. The bullet slammed into Garrick's knee, the force shattering his cybernetic limb in a burst of sparks and metal shards. Garrick collapsed, gasping through clenched teeth. The Hound stepped forward, pressing his pistol against the man's forehead. "Where is Kurran?" Garrick spat blood, laughing. "You're too late." The Hound's grip tightened. "Where?" "Gone." Garrick grinned, even as pain flickered through his eyes. "Headed underground." Beneath the city. The tunnels. The air felt colder suddenly. The Hound's cybernetic eye flickered, scanning deeper, past the broken walls, the shifting foundations beneath the slums. The tunnels were old, predating the Spire, and now something else lived there. Garrick was still laughing. "You think you're scary? Wait till you see what's waiting for you down there, the Whistlers." The Hound's jaw tightened. He already knew. He had heard them in the dark. "Go find Silas," Garrick said. The tunnels beneath the Spire were the city's rotting underbelly, a place where the light of civilization had long since died. The deeper the Hound descended, the more the air thickened, damp with condensation, and layered with the acrid scent of oil and waste. The slums above were a graveyard of the forgotten, but this was something worse. A place where men had long since abandoned their humanity. Down here, the desperate and the depraved gathered in the darkness, drawn to violence like starving animals circling fresh meat. He followed the noise, an ever-growing pulse of sound reverberating through the tunnels, the roar of a crowd echoing off the walls like a living thing. As he stepped through the last crumbling corridor, the space opened before him into an abandoned underground transit hub, the bones of the old world repurposed into something grotesque. A massive iron cage dominated the center of the chamber, ringed by rusted barricades and elevated platforms, where spectators loomed over the pit like carrion birds. Heavy bass music boomed over dozens of speakers. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. High above, half-broken floodlights flickered and buzzed, casting uneven light over the spectacle below. In the center of the cage, a man lay sprawled across the dirt, his breathing shallow, his body bruised and torn. The fight was over. At the far end of the pit, something shifted, stepping forward from the opposite cage door. It moved on 3 legs, its exoskeleton glistening like obsidian, the dim lights reflecting off its chitinous frame. The creature's head was a sharp, unnatural pyramid, its 3 rows of black, glassy eyes catching every movement, absorbing every detail. It didn't lunge, it didn't roar. It only watched. The man in the pit tried to crawl backwards, shaking his head, his hands raised in a feeble attempt at defense. The Whistler did not hesitate. It moved with sudden, precise speed, closing the distance in an instant. A single blow from its elongated, needle-like hand struck his throat, and he collapsed without a sound. The body twitched once, then stilled. The Whistler tilted its head, as if examining its work, then slowly turned its gaze toward the crowd. The spectators erupted in frenzied cheers, stamping their feet, shouting over one another as they placed new bets. The Hound had seen Whistlers kill before, but not like this. There was no primal rage, no reckless slaughter. This one had not fought. It had executed. A slow, rhythmic clapping drew his attention away from the pit. At the highest platform, bathed in flickering neon light, stood Silas Vox. Vox had built his empire on the backs of the desperate, carving out his dominion in the underworld with a mix of brutality and perverse showmanship. He was a man who thrived on spectacle, a merchant of suffering who found joy in the artistry of pain. His cybernetic limbs gleamed under the dim lights, the reinforced plating of his arms etched with intricate filigree, a stark contrast to the crude, rusted tech his men wore. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes filled with cruel amusement as he scanned the crowd before finally settling on the Hound. "No, this is unexpected," Vox drawled, his voice carrying over the noise, amplified through a set of worn-out speakers rigged to the upper levels. "The infamous Hound, prowling through my house like a lost dog. "What brings you down here, friend? Looking to place a bet, or did you just get tired of playing judge, jury, and executioner upstairs?" The Hound said nothing. His cybernetic eye flickered as he scanned the upper platforms, counting a dozen armed guards, all positioned for a quick execution if needed. His fingers flexed at his side, but he did not reach for his weapon. Not yet. Vox leaned forward, grinning. "Ah, I see it now. You're not here for the games, are you? No. You're after our mutual friend, the good doctor. Shame you missed him. Kurran had business elsewhere, but I'm afraid I can't let you leave empty-handed. My guests expect a show, and it would be a real tragedy to disappoint them." At his signal, the gates to the arena groaned open once more. Two figures stepped forward, their bodies wrapped in combat mesh, their limbs reinforced with salvaged cybernetic enhancements. The first was a brute of a man, his frame augmented with military-grade armor plating, his right arm replaced with a heavy-duty pneumatic fist capable of crushing steel. The second was smaller, faster, a woman with sleek augmentations, her hands ending in curved monofilament claws designed to cut through flesh like paper. The crowd roared in approval. "You fight, you win, you live," Vox said, spreading his arms. "Or you don't. Either way, it's a good night for business." The gates slammed shut behind him. The first attack came fast. The brute lunged forward, the pneumatic arm releasing a pressurized hiss as it drove forward with devastating force. The Hound twisted at the last second, the strike missing him by inches as it smashed into the ground, sending dust and debris into the air. The second opponent was already moving, the woman darting in low, her monofilament claws flashing toward his ribs. He caught the attack at the last second, his coat tearing as the blade skimmed just shy of flesh. He retaliated instantly, driving an elbow into her shoulder, knocking her back just enough to give him space. The brute recovered quickly, his mechanical limb pulling back for another crushing blow. The Hound ducked low, moving into his blind spot, and fired a single round from his rail pistol directly into the man's knee joint. The kinetic impact was devastating, metal splintering apart as the massive figure crumpled, roaring in pain. The second assassin did not hesitate. She struck fast, carving a wide arc toward his throat, forcing the Hound to deflect with his forearm. The impact sent a sharp sting through his limb, but he barely felt it. He grabbed her wrist, twisting sharply, forcing the blade away before driving his knee into her stomach. She staggered, gasping for air, but recovered quickly. She feinted left, then right, her claws slicing toward his head. He dodged the first, but the second strike caught the side of his mask, cutting a thin gash across his cheek. The pain was secondary. He countered with brutal efficiency, slamming the butt of his pistol into her temple. She dropped without a sound. The crowd went wild. Vox grinned. "Not bad, but let's see how you handle a real fight." The lever dropped. The Whistler's cage door slid open. The creature did not move at first. It emerged slowly, its bladed fingers twitching as its rows of eyes flickered, taking in the scene before it. Its triangular head tilted, observing the carnage, processing, analyzing. The Hound did not move. The Whistler turned toward the nearest body, the cybernetically enhanced brute, and knelt. It did not attack. It studied. Its needle-like fingers hovered over the ruined cybernetics, tracing along the shattered metal. It examined the mechanical limb, tilted its head, then slowly stood. It had learned, and then it lunged, but not at the Hound. The guards never had a chance. The Whistler moved like liquid shadow, cutting through flesh and metal alike with a terrifying agility. It sliced through the flimsy chain holding the gate and the guards as well. The Hound used the chaos to his advantage, vaulting over the barricades, making for the exit as the arena erupted into panic. As he reached the stairwell, Vox's laughter echoed behind him. "Kurran ain't running from you, Hound," he called out. "He's running to something worse. He told me to tell you. Find him at the beginning." The words stayed with him long after he disappeared into the tunnels. The ruins of the old biomedical facility loomed in the darkness like the carcass of some long-dead beast, its skeletal remains buried beneath layers of dust and decay. The Hound had spent years navigating the bones of the Spire, but this particular ruin was different. This was not abandoned. The original Aegis Biosolutions laboratory, damaged and long forgotten, but not to a man as old as Kurran or himself. He could see light from within, faint, flickering, barely enough to pierce the murky gloom. The cybernetic lens in his right eye scanned the structure, picking up the faintest hints of movement inside. Bodies shifted through the corridors, slow and methodical, their heat signatures barely registering against the cold interior. Kurran was here, and he wasn't alone. The air was thick with something else, a hum, deep and resonant, vibrating just beneath the threshold of human hearing. It wasn't electrical, it wasn't mechanical, it was organic, a sound the Hound had learned to fear. Whistling. The Hound moved through the shattered doorway, his steps precise and soundless, his breath measured. The interior was a graveyard of technology. Rows of shattered biopods, rusting diagnostic equipment, overturned surgical tables covered in dried stains too old to determine their origin. The air carried the faint scent of chemicals, mixed with something sharper. There was something vaguely humanoid built from all the scrap, the Whistler's shape. The walls surrounding the shrine had been painted with symbols, long, curved marks that almost resembled language, but weren't meant for human eyes. This was worship. The shadows shifted ahead. The Hound tensed, his hyperkinetic rail pistol humming as it charged. The deeper the Hound moved into the facility, the heavier the air became, thick with a lingering sterile chill that did nothing to mask the underlying stench of decay. The biomedical complex had been abandoned for years, yet something within it still pulsed with life. An eerie persistence in the whirring of long-forgotten machinery and the flickering of dim emergency lights. He placed an explosive charge against a pillar. He stepped carefully over the desiccated corpses of security personnel who had died where they stood, their bodies left to rot in the same cold corridors they had once been tasked with protecting. Their weapons, now rusted and useless, lay scattered at their sides, silent testaments to whatever violent purge had swept through these halls. The Hound had seen similar remnants of corporate disasters before, entire sectors of the Spire lost to reckless ambition. The silence was not the silence of abandonment, it was the silence of waiting. A door stood ahead, heavier than the others he had passed, its reinforced plating still intact despite the years of neglect. A corporate Aegis Biosolutions insignia was barely visible beneath layers of dust and grime, its once proud lettering now a faint ghost of what had once been a thriving research division. Near the biometric scanner, dried blood had congealed into a dark stain, a final smudge of life left behind by whoever had made it this far before him. The Hound pulled an old security bypass device from his coat, pressing it against the panel, listening as the old system struggled to reawaken. A flicker of light ran through the scanner, the remnants of an AI struggling to process an input it no longer had the capacity to recognize. The screen glowed a weak green, and with a shuddering groan, the door slid open. Beyond it, a stairwell led down into a darkness that swallowed even the dim glow of the facility above. The air that rushed to greet him was different, untouched by time, thick with something more than age and dust. The Hound stepped inside, descending into the unknown. The first thing he noticed was the temperature drop. Not the creeping chill of an old building left to decay, but something sharper, something intentional. A sterile, manufactured cold meant to preserve and contain. The hallway at the bottom of the stairwell was lined with thick, reinforced walls, the floors seamless, sterile, gleaming faintly beneath the dim glow of emergency lighting. Whatever had been hidden here had never been meant to be found. The pods came next. Rows of them stretched along the length of the corridor, tall glass chambers, coated in frost, their biomonitor displays flickering erratically as if caught in a loop. Some still hummed with life, their lights pulsing in slow, methodical intervals, while others had long since failed, their glass cracked, their occupants silent. The Hound approached the nearest pod, clearing the frost from its surface with a gloved hand. Inside, something moved. At first glance, it might have passed for human, but the longer he stared, the more his mind recoiled from what he was seeing. The thing within was twisted, its skin fused with patches of glossy black exoskeletal plating, its elongated limbs twitching in slow, unnatural movements. A row of small, unblinking black eyes ran along the edges of its skull, its mouth slightly parted in a way that suggested it had once been human, but had since forgotten how to breathe. The creature quivered, its fingers long, needle-thin appendages clutching at the air as if searching for something just beyond its grasp. It did not struggle or attempt to break free. It simply waited, as though its mind had long since given up on the possibility of escape. The Hound exhaled slowly and moved to the next pod. The abomination inside was worse. This one had too many limbs, its torso a mess of overlapping muscle and hardened chitin, its face warped beyond recognition. A pair of mandible-like protrusions had begun to form where its jaw should have been, half-developed, frozen in an agonizing state of incompletion. Its fingers were sharp, elongated blades, fused together in places where the human tissue had failed to properly integrate with the alien material. He took another step back, then another. Every pod told the same story, each one holding a failed experiment, a body twisted by a process that had no right to exist. Some were barely recognizable, their forms grotesque parodies of what Kurran had been trying to create. Others were still too human, their features frozen in expressions of agony, their eyes dull due to the machines that had refused to let them die. The audio logs started playing before he even realized there were speakers embedded in the walls. The first was garbled, distorted by time, but Kurran's voice was unmistakable. "I am so close. The others, they failed. Their minds couldn't contain the knowledge." The words rippled through the chamber, bouncing off metal and glass, filling the space with a presence that made the back of the Hound's neck tighten. "The Whistlers are not simply animals. They are something greater, something we should become." The Hound turned toward a nearby console, its screens flickering with reams of data. Genetic sequencing charts, neurological scans, biometric readouts. The files stretched back years, proof that Kurran's experiments had not been the work of a desperate man in the ruins of a dying city. This had started long before the fall of the Spire, a project buried beneath the corporate machine, abandoned and left to rot with the rest of its failures. A single file stood out among the chaos, its title marked in bold red text. Subject: 2,513. Success rate: 0%. The Hound's stomach tightened. He had followed the bodies, tracking Kurran through a trail of dead slum dwellers who had been nothing more than desperate victims. Box was right. Kurran had never been running from him. He had been running toward something else. The final log played then, Kurran's voice clearer, steadier, carrying the weight of a man who believed, without a doubt, that he had glimpsed something divine. "I just need one perfect specimen, and then I will transcend." A sound behind him cut through the stillness like a blade. It was soft at first, like the shifting of cloth against metal, barely audible beneath the hum of machinery. But then it came again, accompanied by a faint, whistling note, fractured and hollow. The Hound exhaled, his grip tightening around his weapon. The corridor stretched into darkness, the cold metallic walls trembling faintly with the pulse of unseen machinery, a rhythmic heartbeat emanating from deep within the bowels of the facility. The Hound moved forward, his boots soundless against the polished floor, his cybernetic eye adjusting to the dim, sterile glow of flickering monitors lining the walls. He could feel it now, that presence, the weight of something vast and unknowable pressing against his mind. It was not fear. It was recognition. He was being watched. The door at the far end of the corridor stood slightly ajar, a single line of cold white light spilling from within. The Hound slowed, shifting his grip on the rail pistol, his breathing steady, controlled. He had followed the bodies, walked through the graves of Kurran's failures, watched half-human things shudder and die in the dark. Whatever was in that room was not a failure. He stepped inside. The lab was vast, stretching out in a cavernous expanse of reinforced steel and glass, its walls lined with suspended containment pods, each one filled with pale, milky fluid, holding shapes that twitched and stirred with grotesque, half-formed movements. Rows of surgical stations lay abandoned, the tables stained with old, dried blood, their tools left scattered as if the last researchers had fled mid-procedure. And in the center of the room, standing before a single glowing containment pod, was Dr. Elias Kurran. He did not flinch when the Hound entered. He did not cower or reach for a weapon. He only smiled, his sunken eyes shining with something beyond madness, something close to rapture. "Ah, the Hound," Kurran said, his voice smooth, measured, filled with genuine curiosity. "I wondered when you'd find me. We didn't get much chance to speak last time. You're so grown up now." The Hound raised his pistol. "It's over." Kurran's smile widened. He gestured to the chamber around them, to the rows of twitching bodies suspended in fluid, to the pulsating heart of his experiment, encased in the largest pod at the room's center. "Is it?" The Hound's gaze flicked to the pod. This one was different, not like the others. Not filled with something broken, something malformed. This one was whole. Inside, suspended in liquid, was a figure that was almost human. Its frame tall and lean, its features smooth, symmetrical, its limbs perfectly proportioned. But beneath the illusion of familiarity, it was something else entirely. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, the faint glow of blue-green veins pulsing just beneath the surface. Its eyes were closed, but the Hound could see the shape of them beneath its lids, too large, too black. Its hands, 5 fingers, unlike the Whistler's. But the bones were too sharp, too tapered, and its posture, even in sleep, suggested something beyond human comprehension. Then its eyes opened. They locked onto the Hound immediately. Kurran let out a breath, his expression one of pure joy. "This one," he whispered, "this one will be different, not another failure like you." The Hound fired, the kinetic round slamming into Kurran's leg, shattering it in an instant. The doctor crumpled to the floor with a strangled gasp, but the pain did not dim the light in his eyes. He laughed. "You still don't understand," Kurran rasped, gripping the console beside him. Before the Hound could fire again, the scientist slammed his palm down on the controls. A warning siren shrieked. Across the lab, the containment pods began to open. The first failed hybrids collapsed to the floor, their malformed bodies convulsing, twitching, their lungs gasping for air they had never learned to breathe properly. Some were still alive, dragging themselves across the ground with shaking, emaciated limbs, their half-formed mouths gasping in agony. Others, more intact, pushed themselves upright, their too many eyes flickering, their elongated fingers clenching into fists. Then, as one, they turned toward him. The Hound did not hesitate. He moved through, his rail pistol snapping off rounds between charges. The creatures shrieked as they fell, half-human, half-Whistler abominations collapsing under his assault. But there were too many. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his breath steady, his mind unwavering. Then the thing from the central pod moved. It did not stumble like the others. It did not jerk or twitch or scream. It simply stood, tilting its head, calculating. Kurran, bleeding out, dragged himself forward on shaking arms, his voice trembling with reverence. "Do you see?" he whispered, his breath ragged. "Do you understand? We are meant to be more." The hybrid watched him, its black, depthless eyes reflecting nothing. Then it reached out. Its fingers pressed gently against Kurran's forehead. For a brief moment, the scientist's expression was one of pure ecstasy, his face alight with realization. Then the whistling began. It started soft, a fractured, unnatural note, spiraling higher and higher in pitch. Kurran's nose began to bleed, then his ears, then his eyes. He convulsed, the sound reached its peak, a high, unbearable frequency, and then Kurran collapsed, dead. The hybrid tilted its head again, as if considering what it had just done. Then it looked at the Hound. He stared back, and he knew. He could not kill this thing. The creatures still filled the room, but they were no longer focused on him. They were focused on the hybrid. Good thing he had prepared for something like this. He had placed several pounds of explosive on the load-bearing pillars on the way in. He activated the destruction sequence. As he sprinted toward the exit, he glanced back one last time. The hybrid was watching him go, standing in the center of the carnage, completely still, its unnatural eyes locked onto him, its expression empty, unreadable. It did not move. It let him leave. The last thing the Hound saw before the explosions consumed the lab was its glowing eyes staring after him. The Hound stood on the ruined streets, staring at the smoking crater where the lab had once been. And as he turned, stepping back into the darkness of the slums, he heard something in the distance, a sound that had haunted him from the beginning. Whistling.